Okay, so welcome back. I welcome you all for the third session of this workshop on COVID-19 pandemic in India, a public archiving initiative. And we move on to dialogue on archiving emotions. So what we have covered until now is ways of looking at the pandemic and acknowledging the crisis in terms of acknowledging collective memory. And I think what comes next once you collect or work with memory is dealing with emotions. And it's easier said than done, as we all would agree. So we have with us Ben Gillespie. I hope that's correct as a pronunciation. I'm sorry if that's not. And Avantika Seth. Avantika is primarily going to moderate this session from here on. So I'm going to quickly introduce them in my best capacity. So Ben is the Arlene and Robert Kogod Secretarial Scholar for Oral History at the Archives of American Art. He's the founder of the Pandemic Oral History Project, and that is what we're excited to hear about. Conducted virtually, the Pandemic Oral History Project features 85 short-form interviews with a diverse group of artists, teachers, curators, and administrators. Thank you very much, Ben, for accepting our invitation. Avantika, she's a journalist, researcher, and oral historian with a particular interest in recording narratives of trauma, violence, memory, and personal life histories using the technique of oral history interviews. In brief, she thinks of herself as a storyteller. Given the wide scale of her interest, she has worked on projects ranging from the 1947 Partition Archive to recording narratives of tsunami survivors in Indonesia. She has been involved in projects around mental health, gender, trauma, and violence in particular. Currently, she is writing life histories in the form of biographies and digital narratives. Alongside, she is engaged in working on a project analyzing moral costs of war. She's also a telephonic befriending volunteer at Samaritans Mumbai, a suicide prevention helpline. Personally, we have known Avantika at Curating for Culture since almost a year now, where she was also working on her grandfather's archive and the project Dear Grandfather at one of our last year initiative called Constructing Personal Archives. So we have known Avantika so closely that we thought this is just the perfect subject, or rather, she's the perfect moderator for taking this initiative forward with us. Thank you, Avantika, for accepting our invitation and accepting to moderate the session from here on. Over to you.
Thank you, Ishita. Firstly, I don't know if I'm like my video is clear or my audio is fine because the internet isn't too great at my end either. But I'm so excited, and I was so excited the moment Ishita shared the theme itself, archiving emotions, and that's something I felt has been so strong in every oral historian's work, because I feel that you don't just archive someone else's emotions. There's a hell lot of your own emotions that come into the picture, and there's a lot of dealing that has to be done with that as well. So I thought that while I know almost all of you since I was here for the last two sessions as well, maybe for Ben, we could do like a quick introduction in like one liner about who we are, where are we joining in from, and interestingly, what have we done with the last two workshops that we were present for. So maybe you could talk about any story you collected, any idea that you formed, or any vision that you have for the archive. So let's just also get into the picture where we really are with the last two workshops. And I think it'll also update Ben with what we've done. So maybe I'll follow Rebecca's strategy. If someone wants to start and then could nominate the other person, I think that's the best.
I think the first person you will still have to Avantika. Okay, so maybe, okay, Lavanya, do you want to start?
Yeah. So I'm a filmmaker, and I was interested in archives because I deal with archival material for my documentary work. And so we had a very interesting, we had two very interesting sessions. And the last one was with Rebecca, where we were asked to collect stories and experiences of people during the pandemic. And I ran into quite a lot of trouble with that because first, when I asked this to my friends, they said it's too open a question, I mean, what about the pandemic? So then, because I had to deal a lot with time as a filmmaker in my work, so I just thought of asking them what was their sense of time during these past few months, and has it shifted? So I got responses to that. Some people texted me, some people sent me images, some people sent audio recordings. And there is another kind of dilemma is because sometimes it's a little meandering. So because the filmmaker in me is itching to edit it into like a format, and I'm like, okay, no, this is supposed to be a collection. So yeah, and I'm also sort of confused because the formats are so different. How do you combine words with audio with still images? So yeah, I'm sort of grappling with all that right now. Yeah, that's about me. So Ansi, you want to go next?
Hi, Ben. I'm Ansi. I'm a researcher based in Delhi. My background is in sociology, and I'm interested in archiving because I just wanted to make sense of the pandemic and how people are reacting under it. So we had two sessions. The first one was by the Anita Singh, where she asked us to cut up different newspaper clippings, um, and and the second session was by Dr. Rebecca, where she asked us to read up a story and discuss it with our group on our reflections on the story. And sorry, I couldn't complete the task which we had to do about the oral history. The thing, I mean, my doubts regarding those were like, as a sociologist, usually we have like a questionnaire and like a proper structured questionnaire at least. So I was confused. How would I, when I'm archiving, do I form like a proper questionnaire and ask, or do I just to give them a free hand and ask them, like, you can say anything or give any image? So regarding that, I was a bit confused. So I would love to hear from you what are your thoughts on that. Yeah, thank you. So the next person I would like to Mavish, would you like to go next?
So I'm an architect and I work with dilapidated furniture. I restore it, and in doing so, I sort of try to carry out the methods of restoration, and I treat the objects as objects of material memory, objects of archival quality, and I also sort of experiment how archiving an object is very different from archiving any other paper or any other material, and then also sort of look into the methodologies of archiving, or whether it's also a very post-colonial construct, or whether there are other ways of archiving, or new methodologies through which we can do that. Similarly, regarding the uh, experiences and the oral histories, so what happened is that I haven't written them down, but I've spoken to a couple of people, and those are my family members, because just recently my family actually faced three of my family members developed COVID, and it was a brutal period for all of us, and we're still trying to recover from it. And it did not end with COVID, but it turned into various other post-COVID complications, post-COVID psychological and mental health issues, post-COVID physical challenges. So those are narratives which my sister and I both we have recorded them, and what I can do is I can complete, when I reach home, I can jot a couple of points from each and submit it over. And I'd like to nominate for the introduction Wallaby. Uh, I hope that's
Hi
okay.
Ben, hi Avantika. Uh, so I'm trained as a public space and an interior designer, and since last year I've been working with curating for culture, and we've been conducting different workshops on archiving, and I've been helping them with visuals. Also, I had been archiving my grandmother's stories and life, and her family owned coal mines before the independence, and yeah, I just wanted to document all those stories, and yeah, so that's why I'm here. I have to nominate Rukmini.
So when I think the last two sessions have been very helpful, especially the first one where I think Dainita Singh talked about the how we should try and stick to a form and constantly check ourselves and ask us what the intention is. And I found myself struggling, especially this time when I was trying to figure out um, how to go about interviewing people, especially something that is related to a pandemic. And when I had casually talked to a couple of friends of mine about if they'd be interested about their experience, I usually just got one word answers. And I think the situation is so overwhelming that it's difficult for people to describe in words. So I came up with a set of questions um, that were not really related to one's emotions or feelings, but I thought maybe if I started slow, like asking people what they did with their day, or what are the clothes that they generally wear, and what have they been reading if they've been reading, or what have they been watching. And I thought maybe going from there, or some of these objects, I could try and explore what their experience has been like. Okay, I'll nominate Palak. So, yeah.
Hi, Rukmini. Thank you for the nomination again. This is interesting. Um, Actually, I don't remember who I nominated yesterday, so I think I'll nominate somebody else. Ben and Avantika, just to give you a little bit of background, Avantika, we've been on the call for the last two sessions as well. And I come from a background of working in creative agency and look at strategy for brands for creating mass producing content and kind of achieve a certain amount of customization in that scale. And here it is a very different kind of an experience. This field is a little different, and I also come from a background similar to Lavanya, which is filmmaking. So storytelling is inherently a part of all of these industries, but the way that a lot of the way the sessions helped me think in terms of a new lens of looking at storytelling is what I have kind of indulged in. And in the first session, in Dayanata's session, it was more about even though I am the form that I have probably a kind of expertise is visual communication, and that's something but in that, what is that? And one of the questions that stayed with me from her session was what Rukmini also mentioned about form, and what is it that what is it that you can do lifelong, how to create a lifelong archive is what she said. And that's something, because I am somebody probably going from one trend to another with the going with the flow and the momentum. So for me to just root myself into that kind of a thought process wherein I'm working on an archive, whether it's personal or otherwise, to have that kind of reference or viewpoint is what I'm thinking on the lines of. And and Rebecca's session kind of helped me in the sense because it was more textual, her work, and not so much of visual imagery in that sense, and how she's been able to pull off a intimate experience with just almost just like, having the stories in the text format. And so those are like few of my learnings from the last two sessions, and really looking forward to what we can move forward in this direction. Yeah. And I will nominate Shravan, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, Palak. Thank you for nominating. So I work as a career coach and I work as a consultant in the social sector. I do quite a bit of work with NGOs, and the past 2 years have made me look at actually the stories of the communities that the NGOs work with, because objectively speaking, when one looks at working in the social sector, it doesn't really make a difference. That's been my experience, and I think personal trauma and trauma as a group, as a community, is something that I have realized has been very helpful in helping them, especially when they've been invisibilized over a period of time. So I missed out on the first session by Dayanika because recovering from a back issue. The second one by Rebecca, I found that really fascinating in terms of the story which we got as a group, which was about a pair of siblings growing up in Japan, with the mother being Japanese, if I remember right, and the father being an American soldier, and how the two brothers split apart, with one focusing on his Japanese roots, whereas the brother sees himself as being more American, and the whole experience about lost and finding each other after having drifted apart during the pandemic. I found a certain resonance with my own family experience of my sister relocating to Australia. Of course, this was much before, and we're kind of getting in touch, but the pandemic kind of blew us off course, in the sense that I had two nephews being born back to back, but uh, no. So neither has my mother been able to see her grandchildren, nor me, my nephews, because of the pandemic situation as of now. I did reach out to friends and their experience in terms of the pandemic, and I found, I've not yet recorded it or submitted it, but I found that there were varying degrees of what they found in terms of their loss, in terms of time itself. Like there are one of my friends who's uh, been in locked in with his daughter and his wife. They've spent the most time they have ever, and that's led to a lot more conflict in terms of, we say familiarity breeds contempt. So the visual metaphor that he said was, he felt like there were porcupines being close to each other, and like in cold you huddle together in this, in the coldness of the trauma of COVID. But because of that, they seem to have pricked each other a lot more, and the entire trauma of being with each other, resulting in a lot of past issues, conflicts, coming up. I could relate it also with friends talking about how some have found, a couple of friends have bridged their differences with their parents somewhat, whereas others have become even more traumatized by the experience of having no other recourse. Like they use words like the Stockholm syndrome of being, having no choice but being with somebody who's emotionally hijacked them throughout their lifetime, and now they're pushed back into those circles. So I don't know where this is going, but
Saloni, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ben. Hi, everybody. I'm Saloni. I'm a recent interior design graduate, and I've not really dealt with archives directly, but I wanted to see if, like, whatever I've drawn by just intuition or using art as a form of self-expression, can archiving be a form of bringing some sense to it? One thing Dayanita ma'am had said during session 1 was to trust in the process, and I think that is what I went ahead with while I try to talk to my friends about what their experiences or emotions or feelings were during the pandemic. So I did not give them a strict narrative, like whatever questions they asked me, if should we write about this, or should it be longer, should it be shorter. So I told them, ki, you decide the narrative and you decide whatever you want to talk about, whatever strikes first. And one thing I used from Rebecca's session from Monday was that she told us about, like, her archive is about lost and found. So that is one thing I used to explain to them the process, what we are going for, if they've lost something or if they've found something in this 1.5 year that they've experienced. And most of the people that I talked to were a younger lot. So there were some connections that I found. One was that all of them tried to belittle their problems. Like one of them said, Ki, mine's a very first world problem. I don't know if it fits into your narrative. And secondly, everybody tried to be very positive. So I don't know if once the storm has gone, so people just look at the positives of it, or when you're talking to somebody who's familiar, you do not want to be vulnerable and let out the traumas that you've gone through, or you do not want to relive the traumas by writing about them again. Yeah, so I found like there were some connects throughout all the stories that I could get. And yeah, thank you. I would nominate next, maybe Aparna could speak if she wants to.
Thanks, Saloni. Hi, Ben. Hi, Avantika, and everyone else. Some of you already know, I spoke about it. I have a PhD in theater and performance. So that's the background I'm coming from. Very academic. But I'm also a visual artist. And in the last 1 year or so is where I have become more conscious of the work I do as a visual artist, which has also made me think about, I mentioned earlier that what are the things that go into it and what are the things that get left out from it, that particular work. As far as the stories are concerned, after Rebecca's workshop 2 days ago, the one thing that I was particularly focusing now newly on was the affective side of the archive. And I'm coming more from a more auto-ethnographic side. So I'm working on what archives do I have within my own experience at this point. And I wondered, I went back to some of my chats from that period with friends and what they were about and what topics was there a pattern. I also found a letter that I wrote to someone in the US, which was probably my last from a UK address before I was going to board a flight for evacuation of Indian citizens abroad and come back to India, worried that my relationship will now stop of letter writing because Indian Post is terribly unreliable. So there are these small artifacts that I found which made me think about both the idea of lost and found, things that exist that you can look at from an affective lens or emotional lens, and what connections that you make, which is something that the first session kind of gave us a perspective on, to kind of put things together in a certain sense, certain pattern of sorts, or a form, whatever that form might be. Certainly not one kind for me. But how can you put things next to each other, really? Yeah, thanks. To nominate someone, can I nominate Mitul? Thanks.
Hi Ben, Avantika, hi everyone. My name is Mitul. I am a photo artist and a curator. I am based in Ahmedabad. I work with archives. I have worked with archives in two very diverse ways. One is a personal art project that I have where I've been archiving and using the archives as the medium, archives, my personal archives of photographs and journals from the past 10 years and a work that has come out of it. And the other is I work in a little more formal capacity with institutional archives. So I work with Navjivan Trust, which is a press, a Gandhian press, which we had begun 100 years ago. And there's another formal project that I'm involved with in archiving. About this program, about the first two sessions, there is a seed of thought that has germinated about what I would like to do through this program and create an archive, but it's still restricted to my own archiving and archiving of my time. And then eventually, if it feels comfortable, I would like to extend it to, also not public, but extend it to my immediate circle maybe. But at this moment, when I am not in a stable space of what I want to do, I would not want to invite someone else into this space, because recounting these experiences could be a harmful exercise, and I would not like to put someone in that space. Yeah, I think that's that. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. And who else? Argor. I'm sorry, I'm just reading what the title is. Will you be okay to continue?
Yes. Hello, my name is Rachit. I am an architect and a performer. I play music. I gravitated towards the idea of archiving because I felt it a personal need, personal and an artistic uh, need to learn to document oral histories and shared traumas, cultures, and traditions better. I've always been a huge advocate for describing the human condition, and so I suppose I'm here to get a better frame of reference on how the rest of the world is doing it, and that's all I have to say. And yeah, I'll nominate Sanjana Girish if she'd like to weigh in.
Hi, Ben. It's nice to meet you after corresponding via email. So I'm working with Ishita and Vallavi on this COVID-19 pandemic archive. So the past few sessions for us has really been about grappling with questions of responsibility and care as we take this project forward. And we've been having a lot of conversations around form, as previously mentioned. Avantika Seth was a photographer who was working with a visual form, whereas like Rebecca was talking to us about her project, which was more textual. So I guess we're really keen to hear your experiences about trying to build this oral history project. As personally, I'm someone who gravitates towards that form, given my background in anthropology and doing fieldwork. So oral histories is something that comes intuitively to me. But we'd be really keen to hear your experiences in trying to build this project. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So then we have two introductions in the chat, which is Navneet and Devankita. I'm just drawing the attention for Ben, and that's about it for introductions. Back to you, Avantika.
Great, thank you so much. What you guys have touched on are really interesting questions, and I'm sure Ben would be able to answer them, and perhaps you could see some of it in my own work as well, because I just made few notes and I saw interesting questions like, how do we connect audio with still image? The concept of familiarity, Ishita mentioned. What do you leave in an archive and what do you keep in an archive? The concept of lost and found. I think very beautiful, which is also the theme of today, emotions of our own and those of others. And also, how is the rest of the world dealing with the archive, pandemic archive? What is happening? So these are interesting questions, and I think Ben, I'm just like throwing it off to you, but would you be willing to talk about the pandemic project at the Archives of American Art and how you guys have dealt with individual interviews, especially because it's an ongoing trauma. We all have realized that one may speak of it, but and that's a personal query as an oral historian. When one gives an interview, is the trauma increased, or is there any balm that gets put to it? So maybe if you could start with that, we would love to hear about your work, and if you want to answer these questions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy to be here and to hear all the amazing work that people are doing. I don't think I can answer everyone's questions. Unfortunately, there are a lot of some of those you're just going to have to find the solution as you do the work, which is really my strategy for everything. Just figure it out on the fly. But I'll talk a little bit about the Pandemic Oral History Project. We had at the Archives of American Art, I had sort of the advantage of like just our mission circumscribed what I could do with the project. So that helps a lot, because I think it's so hard with the pandemic that has touched every aspect of our lives. It's like, how do you go about building an archive when it's, the taint is everywhere, the tinge is everywhere, and you're going to be feeling it forever. No one's life is the same after this. And so being able to focus on gathering these stories from across the art world and the American art world specifically, just having those defined for me helped a lot as we planned outreach. So we started it just as a way of keeping in touch. We didn't think that the pandemic would go on for that long, but we didn't want a big pause in the oral history program. Our traditional oral histories are 4 to 6 hour conversations, a full life story. And so it's quite different. So for the pandemic project, we decided that about 20 minutes would be the right sort of check-in, and then recorded and put on YouTube, because we wanted it to be easily available, and we wanted to work with those sorts of tools for preservation. We decided on using Zoom, mostly because that's the only thing that the Smithsonian approved. So like the approved software, again, just solved it for us. We spent some time doing tech checks to develop our own user guides. And I mean, at this point, people know how to use video conferencing pretty well. But we did have some technical issues of like, how do you help someone who's like 85 to figure out the right audio input on their computer? So it was great. I mean, those were fun adventures, and what was otherwise often a very deep and heavy sort of project. I'll talk a little bit about how we did it, and then I'll try to weave in some of the answers to the questions that have come up. But please bear with me, because archiving emotions are, what sort of object is an emotion is something to think about as you go through this archival exercise. So my primary goal when we were doing this was really conveying the human experience of life under COVID. And since we were working with creatives and people in the museum world, people in the gallery world, it was sort of like how that gave us a great lens of like, how is your work changing? And so to hear from artists like, I had to change my practice because of this. I wasn't able to go to my studio. I wasn't able to work with the fabricators that I worked with in the past. So I had to work with a different material. So those sorts of changes were really interesting, as well as total shifts hearing. So there's a great interview with Vincent Valdez that was conducted by Fernanda Espinosa, where he talks about the death of his mother at the beginning of quarantine in the US, and how he was unable to see her in that time, and how he shifted to portraiture. And portraiture was a way to distill that essence of his memories of people at a time when he was profoundly alienated from those around him. So just stories like that were really powerful. And so I guess the issue is, how do you create the space for a conversation like that? And how do you hold it open? I think the people describing the one-word answers, that was so much of my life was like pulling teeth to get people to talk a little bit. And, you know, it's like, I'm not your therapist, but maybe I can be your therapist for 20 minutes, no fee. And so what was really important for me in doing these was having a pre-interview. One thing that people, when that recording light is on, people speak very differently. And so building that trust beforehand, doing that through the correspondence as you set up the appointment, and then talking before you record anything, just to set the ground rules. You know, so people can say, I really don't want to talk, you know, if they had experienced a loss and that they don't want to talk about it, that's really important. Or if there are other delicate subjects, or if the trauma is too raw, too fresh, if it's ongoing, those sorts of things. So that's all great to talk about. So the questions about what are you watching, what are you reading, those are amazing foundational questions. I also like to do embodied experience. I think people feeling trapped in their own space and like they can't really do too much, your mind is going to wander. You know, so when the body can't move, the brain has to go somewhere. And so really asking people about what are the sights from every day? What is it like? Are you seeing something new in your house now that you're looking at the same stuff all the time? What do you appreciate? What do you want to change? Also, like, how are you dealing with exercise? What sort of daily activity are you getting? How are you feeling in your body in the moment? And so those sorts of things, especially since so many have lost that social relation, where they might experience those things in relation to other people, if that makes sense. Like going out in the world, seeing your friends and family all the time. Without those options, how are you feeling differently? So that was really helpful for me to talk to a few people. I guess, so okay, so the emotional questions, so those they come up in flares, and I wish I had like some smart thing about how like people of different ages expressing different sorts of emotions. And I did find to a certain extent that older people that we interviewed were more comfortable expressing anger. And younger people were more comfortable expressing sadness. And so I don't know if that was a dominant mode or if it, again, was the circumstance of the interview. Like, you know, you're speaking to an archive, and I guess in my millennial brain, the old people don't care about being angry on the record. Young people, no one wants to come off as unhinged on the record. And I would know that to be true of my friends. So I did find that a little bit, but the other thing, as you are dealing with those emotions, with that grief, like the anger is usually concealing grief. You know, that's the spoiler alert. And the difficulty is that it will come in waves. You know, our emotions are not static; they're dynamic, they're ephemeral. You might feel really upset about something for about 2 seconds, and then it's gone, or you express it and it's out the window. And so I think it was really fascinating because people often described numbness, feeling very numb to the world and being stuck in their routine and not being able to break out of what they've been doing, feeling totally impotent in face of the pandemic. Like, you can't fix it. You can only do what you can do for your sphere, for your loved ones. And I feel like that conversation would have changed very much with vaccines. So you're in a very different place for that. We did this all last summer. So vaccines were not yet on the horizon. Really, people were like, oh, well, if we just mask and social distance, it'll be fine. Everyone's going to look out for everyone else. So yeah, definitely a sad movie to replay a little bit. But I think those sorts of things came up, that came up quite a bit. So thinking about that numbness. And so being comfortable with dwelling in that numbness, and this is counteracting. So this is one thing, hearing a little bit about the questionnaire or the finding what was a good nugget out of an interview. I have to get rid of those in my brain. Like, it has to unfold organically as a conversation. If I come in with set questions, I'm going to try to wedge them in, and that's not good. That's not soliciting the best response. That's not allowing the narrator to explain to me how they experience their own lives. And so part of that difficulty, and that's not to say, like a questionnaire or survey can be an incredibly valuable tool. Having questions in advance, incredibly useful. But you have to walk that balance so you're not imposing your understanding of the situation on the person who's speaking to you. Because the whole point is you want what they've got. Like, so you need to encourage them to trust you and to give them the space and the time and the flow to actually articulate it. And so that patience can be really hard, but it's also really rewarding when you give people that space of elaboration. And that can be, so that helps with the emotional processing as well, because you can turn the oral history interview into a format for not healing in some, but perspective towards healing. And being able to say like, oh, actually, I feel awful. I hate this. And that can be a really powerful moment for people to actually stop and reflect on what's been going on, because that numbness is something you have to fight back against. So you have to push through the numbness. And the regression describing with being stuck in toxic cycles with families, definitely that came up a little bit. It was very interesting. People would return to living with parents or loved ones that they hadn't lived with before. And all of a sudden, if you're stuck with them all the time, you realize they don't treat me very well, or I don't like myself when I'm around them. I don't have solutions for that, but do ask about it. It's really important, and each situation is going to be unique. So just keep going, ask about it. I think I had one more thing. Oh, I do. So I really love the idea of the lost and found. What have you lost? What have you found in this year? That's a really helpful framework. And I think that's good for the minimization, which sort of ties in with the numbness that there was several people described, where people wanted to, especially young people, I find, want to minimize their emotional experience and say, it's not that bad, the first world problem. And so getting people to actually address that so you can really paint a vivid picture of the period. So a question that one of my colleagues asked in every interview, and he can get away with doing that, it's fine, it's very natural for him. But he would always ask, what would you want people 100 years from now to know about your experience during COVID-19? And that was a very helpful ending question, because it gets people into the long-term perspective and to actually think, what can I add to this? What is my contribution to the archive? And yeah, so I think that's probably a good place to leave it off. But my main advice always for oral history is that there's no one size fits all. You've got to be adaptive. The most important part is to be prepared structurally to come in with the sorts of things you want to know, but then be prepared to throw that all out the window if that's not what works in the frame of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100% agreed on how important it is to form that kind of trust, because in my work with the Partition Archive, I interviewed more than 100 people just in Mumbai, and this was when I used to travel on trains and just reach their houses, and I understood that I was getting to know the city through its people, through the houses where they were living, and that's how the locality were being disclosed to me. But more than that, what I realized that just a phone conversation before ending up at their place was so much, it just made us both feel so much lighter, and the conversation flew very well. And I mean, I was more adaptive to if the questionnaire or any thought that I had in my mind had to be thrown off, given how the interviewee was. So yeah, like I think that from Ben, we can move to some of my work that I have done around archiving, and one project that I have self-initiated. It's called Finding Home in a Pandemic. So this is when I started. I was supposed to go to Columbia University, and it fell out because of no scholarship. And I was supposed to do the oral history course, and that's when I realized that all universities are doing oral history recordings, and I so started looking at what is the pattern that all of them are following. So Columbia had this one technique where they were interviewing a set of people, and they planned to re-interview them every year. So it would be first 20 people in year 1, year 2, year 3, and then to look at the changes. And I thought that this is probably something I could start with in India. But the project has turned out pretty different, because from the last year to this year, things have been like literally like completely different. And I was having a conversation with Ishita, and I mean, she was saying that probably the pandemic just started now for us in the last 2 months. And as an oral historian, I feel that the conversations I had last year with about 20-25 people were very different from how these conversations would even happen now. I don't know what to say. I think the whole process of doing oral history interviews is so beautiful, because it doesn't just break a boundary between you and your interviewee. It breaks a boundary between you and yourself, where you also realize what are the emotions that you are also capable of feeling. So this archive, I don't know how it's going to look, because I have a lot of questions around design and how to include all of it. Will the website be able to take this kind of material? Should I? My interviews are usually 2.5 hours, so they're long interviews. What material should be available and what should be kept? So these are questions I deal with, which I think in the process will be answered. But for now, I think today it was pertinent to share the work that I have done, or to hear from Ben, and to see where we all are with archiving emotions, especially during the pandemic, because I think it has triggered a lot of what we didn't think we are capable of feeling. And so when I do these everyday recordings, I realize that just recording, just the process of writing makes me feel one way, and the process of recording makes me feel another way. So I think our own feelings are also something that one needs to archive. How am I feeling through the process of it? Because it's historical in its own way. So yeah, this is what I basically had to show. And maybe we could, if you all want to share how you're feeling right now, what thoughts you have, what questions you have, we could take a couple of more minutes and discuss that.
So Avantika, could I suggest if Ben had comments on what he saw in terms of your project and your intentions? Because I think one of the things I'm also curious about is, and this is for the project at Smithsonian, is the choice of how it has been curated. So those who haven't still seen the link, I'm putting it in the chat. Ben, if you could tell us, of course, your thoughts on what Avantika just touched upon. And the reason I'm sort of asking for a response here is because when you started the project last year, and the situations then in the US, and as Avantika remarked, that we both were talking about what her project will mean with what has happened and sort of conspired in the last 2 months in India. What are the kind of thoughts or concerns that you would sort of project for her and for us, but also to sort of extend it into our understanding of how did you decide to curate or put the project out there? So what sort of public interaction is one expecting? Is this content edited? Was it reviewed? Was it put out as it is? What were the intentions of the archive that you were creating?
Yeah, those are all definitely fascinating, great questions for how we do oral history at the archive. So the pandemic oral history project was a little bit new for us, because with our long form interviews, the research object that comes from it is usually the transcript. That's what's most often consulted. People don't listen to the audio quite as often. So with the video, it introduces a new element. And we going by very similar standards to the Columbia Oral History program, we don't edit oral histories. So we'll have a transcript and we allow people to make edits on that. Say you forgot a name, you're like, oh, I meant this person's name is what I misremembered, or this work. So we allow people to add that in through annotations or notes on our transcript, but we don't edit the audio. And so we tell people that up front. You have to be pretty clear up front. And I've been doing a sequence of interviews for a podcast that we're doing that's coming out later this summer. But that's not related to the pandemic at this moment. But it's very different, like that sort of setup where I'm like, say it 5 times. We'll take the best take is what we'll use. Versus the oral history interviews, which it's one takes all. In terms of the public rollout, so we serve as a resource for scholars, researchers, users. So our model is a little bit different because we're not really soliciting public feedback in the same way. We're not looking for direct, comments. I think comments are disabled on our YouTube, even like things like that, where we don't. It's about making this available in the world and then seeing it come back in scholarship. And so building that for art historians, other historians who might use it. Obviously, anthropologists also use our resources quite a bit. So that model is a little bit different. In Avantika's work, I think what struck me is that you have such an amazing space for that interactivity. So it is really reflecting your experience as an oral historian and as you build this archive, because of course you're going to change as you build the archive. Each moment is new and you have to meet it in a new way. And so I think I found that really compelling and exciting for that you have the chance to do that, to adapt as you go along. That was something that was great about the Pandemic Oral History Project, is we got to adapt a little bit, but we ran it over the course of 3 months. So it's maybe a shorter time frame than even what you're looking at, and for understanding the long-term consequences. And so I think we'll see, there are a couple small projects we might do about the after effects of COVID-19 in the US, specifically like galleries or museums that went out of business. Or, how do you do a memorial for people who died from COVID-19 in the art world? So those are questions that we're currently considering, and I think those are really active questions for you. You get to face those head on, and so that's all really exciting to think about. And it's difficult. I mean, definitely some interviews are really hard. We do interviewer questionnaires after the fact, where we ask them to reflect on their experience, and that's very useful because you do have to sort of discharge after all that buildup. Often people are directing very intense affect at you in the interview, and you sort of become the receptacle for their rage or their grief. And so it is important to have that in mind, to be able to hold it, to know that, to recognize that the narrator is not actually mad at you, that you haven't done anything wrong. That you're helping them to actually work through that node, that clot of emotion that they've had. And so I think what's wonderful about these sorts of reflective exercises is the space to work through that for yourself, to not just dismiss it as, oh, I was doing my job, I was interviewing someone. Yes, but you were also a human in that situation and experiencing it at the same time. And thank you for plugging the link. I realized I should do that, and so I wrote up my little thing, and I'll drop that in the chat. I also wrote a brief article for our journal about some of the broader lessons, so I will put that in the chat as well.
Thank you. That would be really useful. So in fact, I want to continue on the last point you made and perhaps touch upon something a little larger, is constantly in this effort of wanting to archive, which is honestly just a month old for us at Curating for Culture, archiving the pandemic. I think constantly I've been hit by this question that, we are not really trained as, I think you remarked about this earlier as well. We are not really trained to deal with trauma, rage, and these variety of emotions. I mean, and when I say trained, I'm really talking about medical training in this scenario. Of course, we might have been trained as oral historians, and I know in a normal scenario also of doing an oral history, when one has been sort of been a recipient of difficult emotions, I've had to come back and unwind and find a way to debrief myself, especially if you're doing it as an individual. And this is what Avantika and I were talking about, the difference of approach in an institution while you do it individually. And this is, and I'm bringing this question up again is because there are at least 15 of us others here who are also thinking about working with somebody else's or their own emotions. But I mean, the question is, are we clinically trained? And hence I want to know, what was the institution's approach to something like this? So were there mechanisms for debriefing? Were there exercises? Was sort of a preparation required? Something that we could borrow if we were continuing as individual archivists?
So we don't, I mean, sadly, we don't have really training for those sorts of methods. We use a mix of trained oral historians who are in the arts world and art historians who have some oral history training. And so it does make for a little bit of a haphazard approach. So for the art historians that we bring in, they only interview people they know. So that helps a little bit because they already have that familiarity and that trust. Just as a friend. And so that helped us quite a bit. And then the oral historians were just sort of like, you know, you know how to deal with this. And the debriefing for us is the questionnaire. I had one conversation with an oral historian where I then became the receptacle for their experience of frustration through an interview process. I mean, some of it is what was fascinating about it is I was pretty sure watching the interview back, is that the anger was about technical frustration. It was an older narrator who really struggled with getting the tech to cooperate. And that sort of ballooned and exploded as anger at everything, like loss of agency in one's own life, not able to master the tools of today. And then that all got directed at the interviewer. And those, just being mindful of those sorts of things as they come up. And we don't have any specific training for it. I guess I've had to deal with a lot of, my training has come through life experience of often dealing with people who are constantly projecting, you know, the image. And I think that part of the video interview exacerbates that a little bit, where they want to constantly convey to you, like, I'm in control of my own life, like I'm unshakable, unflappable. And so just sort of navigating that with respect for how they want to be in the world, how they want to be perceived. And so not threatening that, but also not just going along for the ride if they're yeah, not going along for the ride, I guess, is part of it. So that's the difficult traction to have, I think, in a conversation. And that's part of the pre-interview process, I think, was so crucial for that, to figure out, oh, this person's going to be an issue, or they have their own narrative they want to spin. So acknowledging the way that they want to convey their story, but also pushing back as needed to get a little bit more details, some more nuance. But yeah, in terms of the debrief, we didn't have anything that it was more ad hoc or as needed. And I can send you our interviewer questionnaire that we give to people after interviews.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Rukmini, I do see your raised hand. I have just one last question, and then I'll hand it back to you all. Because it's in continuation, I think the struggle of interviewing online, or even not just interviewing, wanting to collect archives online and doing it digitally. Because I have two projects, to be honest, which I've just shelved them because, I mean, it was working fine. It was not even the tech failure as yet that I had faced, but it's the fact that you don't feel connected. And if you don't feel connected, and going back to your point about, you know, making that, building that trust factor in, and somehow the screen doesn't help you do that. So I wonder, how would it be when you have to talk to them about trauma or difficulty or even a happy moment through the pandemic? Does the screen become a trouble in so many ways, and were there ways one could overcome it? I think even Navneet's one of the earlier message says the same thing, that she's trying to use the phone because at least there's no tech failure there, hopefully. But then I don't know if the disconnect of not seeing the person might be higher than even the screen. So how do you negotiate these ways which we otherwise were very trained with pre-COVID times?
Yes, that was a major concern going forward, and so the pre-interview does serve part of that, building that trust and finding what's the right flow for this person. It really helps that people have been using Zoom and Google Meet so much more, so they're a little more comfortable with it. And what I really found is that people were looking for the chance to divulge these experiences. People needed that outlet, and so sometimes they needed to be coaxed out of them a little bit. I had one interview in particular where in the pre-interview, we were best friends. Like, it was the easiest interview. I was like, this is going to be amazing. And then as soon as that record light was on, it was one-word answers. And it was so brutal because you're like, this is not about me talking. Please help me. But working through that and having faith in yourself in the conversation to be like, I can keep this going. Like, I can find the right tack. Like, we can get back on track. So those were, I think, yeah, it's always a process. You have to be patient. I think when you meet someone in real life for an interview, you have so many cues and you're so used to being able to source them out, like with the, oh, they cross their legs, like they're shutting down, they cross their arms, you can see all of that. And with the video or even on a phone call, you just have to be a little bit more patient and wait for more cues. So for me, it was very crucial to keep them talking and also to not break the silence, because if you let the if you let that tension build on their end, they're going to break. And when they break, they'll be ready to talk a little bit more. So let the social pressures on them, just take it off of yourself. And yeah, silence is a great weapon on Zoom, because people get awkward, they will start talking, and yeah, use that to your advantage.
Thank you. That was very, very pragmatic. I mean, I think because you've experienced it, it was coming straight from the field. Thank you. Rukmini, over to you.
Sorry, Ishita, I just wanted to add a small point there. And what I have realized is also that one, as an oral historian, needs to know when to jump into the trauma, because a large part of the interview is really developing that connection, and it has gotten difficult with the screen. And I prefer to just talk about their life for a great deal till I find that they're now easy, they know about me. So I don't lock myself up in terms of not revealing my own self, I do introduce myself, tell more about how I also feel what they have felt, and try to create a connection. And once, I think it's an intuitive feeling. You just know now the interview has really started. Now this person is in the shoes to talk about it. And that's when you realize that, okay, now silence has to be appreciated. Or this person has to be nudged to talk about certain things. Or yes, you could always have a backup cue questions, which you could just throw out of nowhere. And I repetitively keep on asking this one question throughout my interview is, how are you feeling right now? Even though they're talking about something, and it throws something else altogether, because I think they don't reflect so much on how they're feeling at the moment when they're speaking about something else. So it brings in two different things at the same time. So yeah.
And I think that question is very appreciative, because it also expresses care, right? And we're not just, because somewhere I'm just realizing that my questions make me feel.
Oh, you're on mute, Ishita.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was saying that question is quite appreciable, because you express a sense of care. Because otherwise, when I'm re-listening to my questions in my head, it almost sounds like we want to just take something from them. But that's not the intention of these oral histories per se, generally as well, but not these, where You want them to want to have a safe space and deposit their experience somewhere. So I can understand that this question not only triggers the right experience for them, but also takes care of them in the process. I think your question, and also going back to Ben's question about what do you want people to know 100 years from now, they are a very interesting combination of cues, but also taking care of the intention, both. Yeah. Thanks, Avantika, for adding to that. Okay, so Rukmini and anybody else, if you can just raise the hand button or write in the chat, then the floor is all yours.
I'm not so
Hi.
sure how. Hi, I'm not so sure how connected it is to what you've been talking about, but I think day before yesterday in the Millie collective talks, there was one particular discussion on archiving protest, and a team at IIT, in collaboration with a couple of professors at Ambedkar University, have been gathering data through Twitter and other social media handles. And I was wondering, because Avantika, you work so closely with Facebook posts, and the issue of care again comes up here. And to me, if I personally, when I think of something like this, when you have these oral history interviews of people experiencing the pandemic, I don't see it as data. But of course, we are archiving for the future, in which of course, in some sense, becomes data for the future. But how do you do it with a sense of care where it's not just a collection? And if you're looking at digital material such as Facebook and Twitter and all of that, where do you show that intention of care? And yeah, so this is mainly my question.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's so beautiful that you mentioned the care perspective of it. And this is also the first time I'm trying to curate material which is available online, especially on social media. And what I realized is that there is a certain degree of connection with the post that I'm curating. It doesn't happen for everyone. There is something that speaks to me of the photograph or of what has been written. And I do, just to be conscious of it, I do write to the other person and ask them for their permission, and do talk about the archive that I'm building, and only with their permission this kind of data, I mean, so to say, the obituary would be with the archive. But I feel it's more than care, it's a connection that I intuitively build with somebody who's passed away. For instance, even in the audio recording, just the mention of the woman who passed away and how her daughter has sort of written in the Twitter thread, out of so many stories, that kind of stayed with me, because I'm sure, I don't know why, but just because it's also subjective. I could relate it to my own mother, and I thought that this has to be part of my archive as well. I don't know if it completely answers your question, but I think firstly, just taking permission from the other person, especially in case of taking an entire post from Facebook. Twitter threads, I think, are still okay, but because they are largely in the public domain, but something which is in no mythal, it's not okay, then I will take permission. Yeah. But yeah, so this is something I also have to think through, because it's also the beginning of the project. The post that I shared is of a friend after taking due permission from him. But yeah, the real question is that how does one deal with care with such material? And more than that, I think what kind of material do I really include in my archive? Even in obituaries, which ones are those that go and which ones am I leaving? Is it intentional or unintentional? Because I don't want to leave any, but there are only some that speak to me so much that I do not want to leave them. So yeah, I mean, anybody else, if they want to add to it, I think it would be really, really nice.
I mean, I would extend it to Mithil, just 1 second. So I wanted to extend this question and know from Ben at the Smithsonian Archive. how did you go about choosing the people whom, or selecting, sorry, the people whom you spoke with, and was there a concern about privacy? I mean, of course, I would understand they would have signed consent letters, but in terms of, was somebody ready, not ready to share, even after they recorded, even after they perhaps said yes, but once they opened up, did they feel like, okay, I have shared too much, I don't want it to go out there on the public domain? And again, how does an institution or a project sort of address such sensitive issues?
Yeah, so we do use consent forms, and we collect them up front for the most part. So it's at the day of the interview. We have people sign them, and there are a lot of great examples. If you just look at like oral history consent forms, you should always use one because people are, it's ethical. Do it. And that's always used because you want consent at every part, because you want people to represent themselves in the way they want to be represented. So in terms of privacy, they know, because we're a federal thing. And so everything we produce is public domain, but we do offer restrictions. So if somebody wants say they don't want the video available until after they're dead, we could have that. Or if they don't want the transcript available, except with permission through them, that's also okay. Our lowest level restriction is my favorite well, no restriction is our favorite, obviously, but our second favorite is reference restriction. So a researcher could come to the reference desk and say, I want to consult this interview, and that's adequate enough, but it's not just all over the web. And so we offer those levels. They're sort of difficult to navigate on a smaller level. I'm just really lucky to be in a big institution where like there are people who handle all that, because if I got all the like researcher requests all the time, I would not be having very good days. But so those are really useful. But yeah, so the consent and the privacy, that it definitely comes into play. We had 2 people who requested restrictions on the tail end, and that's just like till time of death. And in terms of like having reviewed those interviews, I don't think it's because of the content. I think it's just because those people are very private and didn't want a video recording of them out there unnecessarily.
Is there an option for anonymity in the project?
No, but someone did ask about that. We got to the late stage, and then this very famous artist who had like mentioned all these specifics for like his gallery, his wife, and then at the end of the interview it was like, this is anonymous, right? I think offering an anonymous option is great, but you have to be mindful of those things. And so at the end I was like, I don't know how we would anonymize this since you keep talking about yourself, but we could do our best. But it was not anonymized. I'm not going to tell you which one it was. That was actually my least favorite interview. So.
Okay, thank you. Over to Mithul.
So I had a question, but before that, the reason why I nodded as a no was, I mean, this was being discussed earlier today at Millie. There are legal aspects of copyright, but then there are ethical and moral aspects of copyright. So when I am taking a screenshot of a Twitter post, you're giving out identity. They might have in that moment shared what they felt like, but when you pull it out and put it in a different context, to me, it feels like they need to know about this, right? And the other aspect is also consent. It cannot be assumed perpetually. So a lot of times when I am using certain images, I feel like I need to let the people know that this is where this image is going, right? My thoughts, not necessarily universal. The question I had was to everyone, not necessarily someone in particular, but after the production of the entire thing of an archive in any medium that we have, where the aspect when we are putting it out there to be accessed, especially with an archive on the subject that we are talking about, does something like a slightly more elaborate version of a trigger warning make sense when we're putting it out there? And is that a responsibility of the archivist or the designer or the curator who is putting it out. It's given the nature of the content that we might want to put out in the public forum.
Ben, do you want to take that on, and then Avantika could add in?
I think the audio broke just a little bit for me for that. Was it about like a trigger warning for the content that's going on?
When it's finally going into the public forum, is it in any way the responsibility of whoever's putting it, if it's the producer, if it's the gallery, the curator, whoever? Does it become in any way a responsibility of them to put out a form of trigger warning of what the content might be?
We've had this conversation several times. We do not have trigger warnings, and for the most part, the content is not doesn't rise to the level of like really bypassing it. There are a couple oral histories we have historically that I think should have trigger warnings, but our website doesn't support them at the moment. I'm hoping with the next website upgrade that they can add them. But yeah, so I think so when you go to a gallery, so I just saw an amazing Laura Aguilar show at the Leslie Lowen Museum, and she has an amazing series of videos from the 1980s where she basically exercises the demons of her suicidal thoughts by talking about them, by making them explicit. And they had great trigger warnings around there. And I think that's important so people can make an informed decision before they view content like that. Especially like for children also, so parents can make an informed decision. So I think they're great in general. They're just maybe a little more difficult to implement online, but you could always do it as like if you're doing a YouTube video, you can always have a slide up front to do it for a few seconds to warn people.
Right. And I agree with Ben. It's something I didn't think through before, but I feel it could definitely be put out somewhere in the website or before every interview, or at least before an audio recording. I'm just wondering that when you talk about an archive that deals with emotions and feelings, is it also self-exploratory? What kind of content would you come across, and still does it make sense? I mean, to be on the safer side, it does, and one should. One could, but I'm also thinking about my own project, and when it talks about severe feelings and it's explicitly mentioned, then should I give trigger warnings? Because also the entire oral history interview would not be available just for public access like that. I do understand this is very personal material that cannot be shared with anyone and everyone who just wants to view it. So there has to be some discretion about who views it and how. But just the objects and the podcast, like the audio recordings, those will be publicly available. But before obituaries, then again, yes. So I think it's also with what category and where this needs to be given, or if there needs to be a choice made that it needs to be on every page with every content.
Does anybody want to add to that, or comment on how they feel about need for trigger warning as a remark or a reminder? Alert signs.
I don't have my video on because of bandwidth. If that's okay, I just want to add one more thing. I really, I was wondering if adding triggers, yes, there's a functional value to that. But also in this time, looking back at my own experience and emotional journey, I feel there are such things that at times trigger equally vague state of mind. I don't know if I'm low or if I'm restless or if I'm feeling anxious or if this is trauma that's coming up, etc. That sometimes triggers are very hard to categorize, especially with the experience of the pandemic, along with, say, other traumatic experiences of the past. So I'm wondering whether that also counts as an agency to figure out, well, no, at this point I want to stop regardless of whether this is a trigger or not, or maybe suicide doesn't trigger me actually. I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking aloud. I'm wondering whether we can give enough trigger warnings is what I'm trying to say, that could there be enough trigger warnings for the content that we make? And so how does then where do you draw the line? Yeah.
I had a very similar thought when I was listening to this question, is how do we even decide that this is a trigger for somebody and this is not? Is if it doesn't become too bloodthirsty, then it's not trigger warning. So I think, and especially I'm comparing between what I'm seeing on social media in terms of it's easier to identify something that will trigger because it's visual, when somebody's getting beaten up or you see blood or you see death, and then how do you decide when you are working with audio material or something which is to do with sound? So yeah, I mean, if Avantika or even Ben or anybody has any other thoughts on what is the way of deciding if there's a trigger warning on something or not? Would you want one, or would? Of course, I think everybody would want one. Yes, of course, Mithul.
So let me be honest. This thought occurred to me when I was listening to your recording, Avantika. I think it was on Spotify, is where you played it from. So the question came to me with that: was I ready? Or did I want to listen to it right now? Because it did generate a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings that I might not have wanted to, right? And of course, this question of how do you define triggers in these times and how do you categorize them is a different question altogether. I agree with, but why I also question is because it is in a way our ownership of this content that we are putting it out there. So more than the functional aspect of should there be, my question is slightly more inwarded: am I responsible to put it out there? Should I be doing it? And this aspect of caring of interviewers that we are doing, should that be extended to the audience that we are, putting it out there for? Of course, there's no one answer, and also a very broad question which will vary diversely with different kinds of projects. But yeah, I mean, just a thought that I thought I'd share.
A fantastic point you've made, and I think point well taken in terms of saying that even for a session like this, one could have pre-announced that we're going to listen to something like this, or we're going to deal with something like this, and only if you want to, and only if you're ready for it. I completely agree. Yes, the care should not only be for people you are interacting with or have gone through, but who are going to deal with it. Yes, point well taken. Thanks, Mithul, for raising that. I think a lot more to think about. Sanjana, I think you are the one who's also putting it in the document, right?
Yeah, I've been just
so
copy pasting the stuff from the chat. Yeah. Yeah. I had a question. Can I ask now? But I know there are other people who raised their hands. So if you want to take their questions first and come back to me, I'm happy to do that.
We just follow the sequence. So it's Sanjana, Mevish, Navneet. Yeah.
Okay. So my question was a general question to both Ben and Avantika, but I was really thinking about the question of how we choose the people for our interviews and who forms this composite, like the composition of the interviewee pool. And I was wondering if you, both of you, had reflected on the gaps in whose stories aren't told, and how do we think about then this question of responsibility of whose story are we giving a platform for, and how do we deal with the gaps of the people we haven't interviewed, and how do we acknowledge that there are stories that are incomplete, and also stories that have not at all been told, especially because I guess in this process of choosing who we interview, there are there's a question of bias, right? Maybe this is an institutional bias in terms of who is chosen. Maybe this is our own personal bias, and maybe it's also a question of access. And given all these considerations, how do we grapple with this question of whose story do we tell, and how do we make sure that we're giving the how do we make sure this platform is an equitable space for everyone, given that lots of people's stories are invisibilized and are sidelined. And there's, so those are my thoughts. Sorry for the lengthy wording of my question, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I realized someone asked about how we chose interviewees earlier, and I didn't answer that. So we had a big team discussion. So it was like all across the archives. The project originated as a chance to check in with people who had already, whose oral histories were delayed. And so we're like, oh, we're not doing your full interview yet, but we'd love to do this short check-in with you. And so that's how it started. And then we realized, oh, we should do a lot of these because we're not going to be doing in-person oral histories for a long time. And so it grew from there, and we realized we needed to look at geographic diversity. We needed to look at diversity of ages. We wanted to look at diversity of medium, since we focus on the arts. So people will do all sorts of different work. Within that, so thinking about people who are outside of like the gallery scene. And so then also we wanted to talk to arts administrators. There's a great interview with Dina Kogod, who is the CEO of United Artists, which is a fantastic organization in the US for funding artists. So just talking to administrators or people more on the ground. In terms of biases and the stories that are not held in the archives, you can't have a complete archives. So I think that's it's something that we're always reckoning with, is how do you deal with that? Because a complete archives would be just like it's sort of terrifying how encompassing that would be. But one way that I find helps to mitigate it is in writing about it, to acknowledge what was missed, because you can't be, we often get caught up in the things we didn't preserve. And so acknowledging that, I think, is really important. So even if it's an exercise before you put it out there of talking about like, this is what I wish we could have included, or what we could have captured. And that maybe in the material or the writing around the project, once you put it out on the world, that's where you include it. And you write about like, this is what we were able to get. And so to have that sort of the positive sense of this is what we have. But of course, the text on the page is surrounded by white space. And so that's something I try to keep in mind.
Sanjana, just to add on to that, I think as an individual oral historian, when I started meandering too much over this question of what is it that I was missing, I stopped interviewing what I even had. So I was just getting caught up in this loop that it's a COVID situation. I'm at my home and I'm doing interviews over Zoom while there are migrants who are walking back home, and I'm not even stepping out to interview those people. And then came bigger questions of privilege, then came bigger questions of what is the sense of even doing these interviews. And I saw myself just in this loop. So when I've thought of restarting the project, that's why I've aimed to keep different categories, which are open categories, which do involve people who stayed at their home and also people who were home away from home. So it does involve migrants. It does involve the differentiation is only that are they from the big cities or are they small towners, and where were they in the pandemic? I think it's confusing for me personally, and maybe that's a space to learn as well. That where do you draw the line? What are the constraints that you keep and do not keep in the archive? Because I think then it becomes an open space that I'm going to interview migrants, I'm going to interview journalists, I'm going to interview any other frontline worker. And so I don't know, I'll also find it with time. Will it lead to a clutter where I'm trying to not miss anything? Or just overthinking about what I'm missing will lead me to stop doing what I already have in hand? So just these were my thoughts about it.
Mavish?
Hi. Regarding talking about triggers, I don't have a question. It's just a point of discussion or a thought that I'm carrying since yesterday. And we're already going through this pandemic, and we're talking about archiving it or recently I also did this installation in which I sort of tried to look at my own artistic practice or my own artistic process during the whole pandemic. And that was sort of the curator's call was sort of to look at your own practice and how it had changed. And then, it was not a call for an artwork, but it was rather a call for the uh, for exhibiting your process. And so I ended up putting up an installation, which I also shared with a couple of you in the CPA WhatsApp group. And it was regarding, the whole pandemic and how I had lost my dog and this and that. And right after that, my family went into this turmoil. Just yesterday, there was this incident in Canada, and two of my siblings live there. And my family, and not to say that even when I'm talking, I think that I should say trigger warning, and I'm not going to use those words. But a lot happened there. And because I have two sisters there, and things had just started opening up, and opening up in Canada, and things were just looking a little bit better because, day before yesterday, my parents had a bit of a smile on their faces while both were bedridden. But they both still had a little bit of smile. But yesterday they looked horrified. And to me, whatever had happened in Canada, and because I have two sisters there, and that secondhand trauma, what I'm trying to indicate is this: that yes, we do need to give that trigger warning to other people, but that trauma that we are facing as artists, or the trauma that we are facing as writers, as archivists, as thinkers, what about that? How do you disassociate yourself? Because if I do feel that, okay, life was getting back to normal, and right now I'm talking about three different geographical locations. I'm talking about Canada, I'm talking about Rawalpindi in Pakistan, then I'm talking about Lahore. But all those three geographical locations were disturbed by something that has happened to another family of same ethnicity, same religion. And just the fact that two of my siblings live in the same vicinity, the whole thing went back to that square one, and then the thing is this, that we are giving those trigger warnings, and we understand those ethical implications of even how to talk into a public forum, or whether to wear a keffiyeh or not, these kind of things. But that secondhand trauma that one is facing, because everything, pandemic is one thing, but when pandemic combines itself with war, when it combines itself with hate crimes or mass murders, and when that reaches you, I just feel that I just feel that I'm dumbstruck at that point. And how do you disassociate yourself? Do you just lay low, or do you think that, oh my God, you're too emotional about it, this is not something that should become a part of your work? Because it really is a part of the whole work, because I feel that this is happening in layers. So that was my comment, or a point of discussion that I do wanted to share with the group. Thanks.
Thanks, Mavish. I think that's a very interesting
that's
take. Anybody wants to respond? Yes, Ben, please.
I just wanted to say that's an incredible issue that we run into all the time. Especially with interviews, like, you can't pretend that you live in a vacuum, that you're just an interviewer hopping in there, and that the world isn't going on outside. And so, to my mind, I guess I don't have there's no perfect solution that I found, but one thing that's really helpful is trying to check in with myself. And so extending that compassion to myself, and be like, oh, I'm feeling really rough about this, as I'm sure to no one's surprise, as things started opening up in the US, the return to gun violence, including a massacre in my hometown grocery store. And so how do you get back to work with something like that? Well, first I acknowledge that I'm not designed to be a worker. Like that's not my whole life. And so it's okay to feel sorry, to feel that sadness. And then if it does intersect with my work, I want that grief to sharpen my questions and my sensibility, and to also to make me more sensitive to other people's trauma as they're going through it as well. So trying to let it remind me that we are all connected in this.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, that's such a softer understanding of what we are dealing with. But yes, we are also connected. Navneet? Hi.
It's regarding, like one thing where we are choosing between stories or the content. I would say, I would use this word, the content, whether it's like stories of others or stories, like even if we take example of Avantika's self, the podcast project where she's recording herself every day, every moment, but choosing between the content to share, or majorly I would say that upload, because everything is happening digitally these days, and uploading to the Spotify or any medium which is easily available online for sharing purpose. On the second aspect, we always as an archivist, or the way, like yes, as an archivist, we also think that we are responsible to to decide that which information should, archive access should be discrete or open to all. That call also comes at certain point of time. And third is, like, once we upload something on the internet, even if as an honor I delete it maybe after a month or week or even the second day, it remains, like, we delete it but it stays there. That kind of system is, the technology is that way. So and as Mithul was saying, unfortunately, I could not see the whole workshop this afternoon because of the electricity problem. But I'm also aware of the ethical aspect, which Millie workshop was also, having that discussion today. That ethical aspect of data handling, basically. So there's a very thin layer how to keep, because if even I'm taking very recent example from this talk only, where, like, Avantika, suppose you are uploading your recorded voice, and after few days you feel that, okay, this should not be, I should remove it, or I should put trigger warning even, but once it is gone, it is gone. So yeah, so my question is, how would how would we keep track on, because when we start a project, we go by simple, like, as and when things come, and when we learn, okay, this is not the right process, now we need to correct ourselves or our practices in future, as we go, as we progress in this project. And then we also start understanding the legal aspect, ethical aspect. Then how would you deal with this? The same question is for you, Ben, because once in the beginning we do test and trials, later on we decide this should not be the part of process, or this archive should only be discredited to certain people. But then how to take U-turn from there, because this is the technology.
Navneet, I think these are the questions one would, at least I would deal with before the archive gets public in any way. So even the oral history interviews that I've done last year, they aren't out. They are still in my hard drive, 25 interviews. Nobody has listened to them except me. And I have made promise to the people that when whatever happens to them will be done after their consent again. Like even after the consent form, I will reach out to them once again with whatever I choose to do, only with their permission. So with regards to material of others, I think one has to be very careful of, and this has to be answered way before the archive gets public in any way. But material of my own, audio recordings, I inherently believe in my voice, and I feel that it's also a coping mechanism for me to talk about what is happening to me right now and what happens when I look at social media and what thoughts I go through. If tomorrow I do understand that one could give trigger warnings, but now I'm also contemplating that my project says 1 year in a pandemic, and it has a trailer which talks about this year and my mental status. So it's not. I think only those people would engage in it once they who are interested in the conversation. And I feel that if I give too many warnings, am I also diluting my own feelings? I'm like Mahvish said, that am I also diluting what I have felt in the process of it, and constantly making sure that the other person doesn't even touch that territory? And in a larger perspective, does that dilute the larger impact of the pandemic? Because the impact is there for me, for you, for anyone. How can we make sure that we don't even dilute the we are also archiving the impact of it mentally on our feelings on an everyday basis. So with whatever material that is related to my own feelings, my own thoughts, even my diary entries for that matter, I think that uh, I I am fairly okay with changing the process of it even later. If tomorrow I decide that I'm going to do the pandemic series only 2 in 6 months, I will be okay with it. But I will not be okay with doing this to somebody else's material at all. And that has to be done with utmost care.
No, like I'm sorry. I was saying that I understand because when we work with oral history or even with the written, like because I work with photographs or the text or any other material, before taking it out to the public, there is a process, and yes, sometimes it stays back in our database for 2 years also, and more than it also. And my question was, once it is gone by just and later on somebody changes, my question is related to technology. Once it is gone and later on something comes up, so we delete that part because of the later changes, but it is there existing, it is existing there on the internet.
So you're
So
saying that it never gets lost, basically, even though you
yes,
may try to delete what you've
yes,
done, but it's done, which is
yes.
true. I mean, yeah.
Yes, Ben, I would also like to hear
Yeah.
from you what you.
They make it easy because I'm not allowed to delete anything because it's federal property. So if I delete something without permission, I'm breaking the law. So we keep copies of everything. I think one thing that's really useful is to research some digital preservation skills, because any file that you save is going to degrade over time. So that's just one very pragmatic consideration, is to look at what sorts of audio files am I keeping, what sorts of video files, what's the half-life of them, how do you store them in multiple places to be assured that they survive. But yeah, we keep everything. And so that's a big consideration. Even if it doesn't go online, even if it never sees the light of day, we have it saved on a secure hard drive, so it'll live forever. So in case, that's just useful. And I was going to look at, about keeping the emotions and false sentiments, because I need to hop off for another meeting, unfortunately. I just wanted to give a quick comment about, I think that's a big thing in oral history. No matter what you're going to do, there are going to be false sentiments, because speech and conversation are they're fluctuant. People's feelings change by the second. And even after, I find this all the time, right after I say something, I'm like, oh, that's not how I really feel. I just needed to express it and get it out there. And so patience and embracing the silence. I think even though you're focused on the content of the speech through everything, but as you're conducting those oral histories, keep checking in with yourself as you go through it, and don't be afraid to circle back to a question. Even if you touched on a harsh note and someone was a little bit upset, don't be afraid to be patient. Give yourself that space to sort of to sift through it, because you don't want to impose what sort of object this should be as you're conducting it. Because if you get stuck in your head about this needs to be a beautiful, polished, eloquent interview, it's not going to be that. Or if it is, it's only going to be the false premise of that. But I just want to thank everyone for an amazing conversation. It's so fantastic to hear about all the work you're doing. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to offer any advice that I can from afar, and just want to send very good wishes to everyone living through a difficult time. We are all in this together, and I'm glad that you are able to connect in this way, and that I'm also able to connect with you to talk about it a little bit and see what we can do.
Thank you so much, Ben. I understand we took a little more time. We can take 2 minutes more and listen to you and then close it.
This is connected to something that was going on in my mind earlier, which is that I journal, and every single time, and I've been journaling for years now, but every single time I try to sit down and write about my day, first of all, I decide, okay, I will write every day, which never happens. And then every 5th day, I will apologize as the first sentence, so I haven't been regular. That would be my first journal entry. And then, so I said, okay, you know what, I'm going to journal when I feel the need to write about something, or when I'm feeling something very prominently. And that was one way in which I kind of selected. But even then, even on a say a significant day, oh, today's the last day of my job, I want to write down something I did today so I will remember it. It's like, it's so easy to fill up 5 pages. And that discretion, how do you decide where to stop? That anxiety is anyway there. So I completely feel, when Avantika was talking about this kind of paralysis of almost, where do you stop? The other thing that is related to it is something very similar, where I just completely stopped drawing and painting because there was so much happening, as Mehwish said. There's the pandemic, and then there's pandemic with Gaza. There's pandemic with all kinds of things happening in India itself. And how do you channelize a very interior emotion that you're feeling in engagement with political, supposedly collective experience of things? It is paralyzing at times. And I had someone very nicely answer that question to me in another workshop, where I said, oh, how can I respond to this time? How can I respond to this time? And they said, well, you know what, sometimes just take in the time and do what you're doing. It's not necessarily to really capture it. So I'm trying to say these two things in relation to each other, the anxiety of trying to capture it, and the moment to journal and really, where journaling is a metaphor really of archiving, just that anxiety of like, am I going to miss out on something? And on the other hand, like really trying to do it in the moment, and we are, hostages to our memory. And what do? We just let go at times to just say, okay, whatever we produce is an archive of its own right, in its own right. Yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Aparna. Rukmini?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, as archivists, do we also need to think about how much digital space we're taking up, or space in general? Of course, I mean, it starts from the smallest thing, like, for example, like, I think Ishita knows I'm doing this, but to everybody else, I've been recording the sounds of some buses, and like Avantika's things, my recordings are 3 hours long, sometimes 4 hours, and it comes down to, I don't have the money to even put it up. And also, who's going to listen to it? And of course, you'll always make the decision of holding back on some parts of it and only sharing some amount of it. So that's one thing, I mean, in terms of the practicality of space digitally, that I always keep thinking of, and storage online. But also the other thing I was thinking of is there's so much excessive information, which I'm not saying it's good or bad, it exists. And for example, now over these sessions, we've met so many people who are archiving the pandemic itself. And not that anything is in excess, but there is so much there already now. So as someone who is now archiving something, how do you deal with this? Yeah. I'm not sure if this is a question, these are just thoughts in my head.
It's a very valid question, Rukmini. I don't know if anybody has given it a thought. I at least can speak for when I had the opportunity of physical archiving and the kind of projects I've worked on, constantly thinking about the amount of space papers and the materials we're occupying, and then it would obviously connect you to the land of politics of land and occupation of space. And on digital, I think the only thing I've experienced is how a lot of redundant data. So I really speak again for myself. Filtering doesn't become a habit, and then I feel very worried about the data itself, not so much about the space, but about the digital archive, whether it's thought through. Just because you have a volume of space, if you didn't have it, it's like that 36 film roll. If you're only 36, you would have been so much more careful. And the moment you have a digital camera, you go around shooting whatever you like. So I think that's the tussle I've faced, at least personally. Anybody else? Any thoughts on what Rukmini said or what Aparna said?
Just a bit to add on to that is just the costing of it and the thought of where will these 3-hour interviews even be put up, and if I do not put them up anywhere, are they going to sit with me in my hard drive, or what kind of organizations can even use them, what libraries? I don't know. So these were these were also the questions that stopped me going beyond 25 last year, to be honest, because I didn't know what I would be doing with this data. I wanted to do so much with these interviews, but just not understanding where and the design and the website and all these aspects, which I don't understand any which ways. So it is a big barrier, and I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, thank you for that question, though.
Mithul?
I think something that Aparna said just struck a chord, because this is a question especially photographers or documentary photographers, I as a photographer have been struggling with over a period of time of what do we capture, what do we live, what do we stay in that moment, right? And again, also in the aspect of journaling, I have been trying to journal or journaling for about 8 years now, and so no solution. But what I found helpful was just that, not bashing myself for not being able to write. And I think with this practice, what has helped me is I instinctively, if there's something that I instinctively feel, and you just go to your journal and write that. And I think that the same follows with photographing, the same follows with archiving. And I mean, what we have is what the archive is, right? So how much ever, where's the line that this is what I have and this is now my archive, which is complete. It never stops. Or if there's something missed, that's not part of the archive. It's what we have is, I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's just a chain of thoughts that come on after you.
Thank you, Mithul. That's an interesting continuation of that thought. When is it complete, or when do we decide it's complete? Especially, I think, when it's about us. I think, but everything is about us also. Okay, I'm not trying to be philosophical, but yeah, very, very similar challenges which one has seen even in institutional projects. So it's not just about the personal archive. Sometimes it's also about institutional archive. Where does it stop, So, and once you take a call, is it too biased? So I think some of these questions will continue to remain how we answer for ourselves and keep exchanging notes. So, yes, Marish.
I just wanted to be clear on one thing, very little question. You asked us to sort of put in the oral histories or something that we've recorded into the assignment section. So I was just thinking, I had a couple of things, which I was gathering because I was also conducting architecture design studio with my students, and we were actually looking into quarantine spaces. I teach architectural history, design studio, and then I teach architectural history. And then we also looked at architectural history from a perspective of the Black Plague, and then how my assignments quickly changed when I had to take design studios online, and how I had to actually keep my history students alive on the screen. So I have lots and lots of those assignments that I designed during the pandemic, and it was also a challenging thing, when it comes to academia and when it comes to also engage the young students. So I was just thinking whether I can sort of share that with you,
I mean, choice is completely yours. Sorry, Mavish, for interrupting, but I mean, how we are looking at this exercise for now, but also the archive, we really want to empower the one who's submitting or contributing. And I think that is why Ben's question is what we start with, not keep it towards the end. What do you want people to know 100 years from now about the pandemic and about you in the pandemic? So if you think of all the things that, I think you're just reminding me that maybe we should share these FAQs, which we have put on the website for contributors, which might be useful for all of you also, is if you think these curriculums is something that defines your experience of the pandemic and you want it to be archived for eternity. I mean, I would want to think eternity. That be it, So you are making that difficult, but also that power-struck decision that this part of my life needs to be archived and not necessarily my sorrows, my challenges at work, So yeah, the answer is with you.
All right. Because I did feel that, for example, if you ask me and if you ask a couple of my other friends, right? So we'll just say, 2020 was far better than 2021. And, it's a general comment for a lot of people that I know. And it's because, initially we were just struck by this, and then, most of us were not affected by it. So we were just trying to keep on still working. And until and unless, even 2 months before, I kept on, and also had this conversation with you guys, that I kept on thinking that everyone's sleeping, everyone's working from home, and I'm the one still working, and I'm the one still trying to design those things and that. So that was like my experience of the pandemic, because, and I just thought that whether, even our WhatsApp conversations, so even if, for instance, for this, I was just looking into this, even if we just write pandemic in our WhatsApp, search box, so we will find all those conversations that we had with our friends in our WhatsApp, which contained the word pandemic, or then COVID-19, or then words like Corona, and then we will find, really amazing conversations and lived histories right over there in our WhatsApp conversations. Even, as meager as that, okay, I'm coming over to your place. I hope your drawing room does not have Corona. These kind of conversations. So I was just thinking whether, you are looking at such a thing or not.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, we really don't have, we don't want this archive to be already pre-decided or defined by us who are really facilitating it. We won't even call us archivists at this point, because we really want to see what content comes in, and then who are we the archivists, or do we invite more archivists on board? So keeping all of that in mind, our intent of this archive was to really empower and create a safe space for the contributor. So they decide now whether they want to make a series of archival objects and then put that series into this. We have received one such contribution where somebody's worked with series of videos, and then when asked, we suggested you could put the whole playlist or put a link so somebody can go and see the whole series, or somebody just wants to archive one moment. And also, I don't think it's really about one or two. So today you feel like archiving something, and then I think we are now thinking like the contributor whom we were, or the interviewee. So after 15 days, you feel, no, I also think this should be archived. So go and put in the second entry. I mean, so that is how you can imagine this exercise as well. And actually, thanks for bringing that question, because I think that is what we can close with. So the exercise 3 is really about yourself now. So in the drive, we request everyone, and I think I'll make sure that I share the FAQs with you all by tomorrow morning, archive your own experience. So just to give you a trajectory again, we moved from looking at media and we looked at public information, which we worked with Dayanita, and then the exercise until today was to speak to somebody else and collect their experience. And from here, we want you to archive your own experience, emotion, and in whichever format. So as I said, I'll share all the do's and don'ts, or what we have shared for the larger archive. But if that's the exercise, and as I told Lavanya, we look at all these three together on Friday and speak about and respond to each other, but also speak about the public interface, but also speak about this archive, because we'll already have, if everybody does it, we'll at least have 15 or 18 into 3 archival objects, which is more than enough in terms of wanting to see the diversity and the emotions and the form, so on and so forth. So that's the plan for now. It's been long into the night, and I know everybody must be also craving for some dinner. Thank you so much for, again, being with us for one more session and finding meanings along with us around this project. I hope it also sort of inspires you in your exercise of wanting to archive. And if it was difficult and if it was intense, I really hope you find some way to unwind tonight. That's it. Thank you so much, and see you on Friday morning. Friday morning, yes, Friday morning, 10 a.m. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Avantika, so much, and see you guys. Good night.